Okay, so we have started the recording, and it is my pleasure today to introduce the second in a series of webinars related to learning experience design for the Design and Development Division. My name is Matthew Schmidt, and I am the current president of the division. And we, as a team of editors, released a book on learner and user experience methods, an introduction to the field of learning and instructional design and technology in 2020. And Dr. Gregg and her colleagues included a chapter in that book. And today they're going to be giving a webinar that goes over that chapter. It's entitled Think-Aloud Methods for Learning Experience Design, Just-in-Time and Systematic Methods to Improve Course Designs. So on that note, I'm going to pass the mic to our presenter who can present her author team. So it's all you.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Great to be here and great to see so much interest in this topic. We have been involved for many years. And just quickly to talk about who's here. So myself, I'm currently an Enrolled Director of Online Pedagogy. Rhonda Reed, currently a project manager. Tuche Aldemir, currently postdoc at UConn. Amy Garbrick, Director of Learning Design, and Jen Gray, an instructional designer. The important thing, I think, especially given the division and AECT, is that we were all in some ways either are or were instructional designers. So a lot of our sort of passion and focus comes from always improving the learning and learner experience. With that, and this is in the book, and you've probably seen this if this is an area you're interested in, but all of our work goes to looking at sort of any sort of tension between designer intention and actual user experience. And so that should frame everything, whether we're talking about systematic or just-in-time sort of approaches to this. And just a quick overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to talk really briefly about what we mean by systematic versus just-in-time, briefly about sort of how we got into this area, what prompted it, defining think-aloud observations. That is one where there is a lot of research, theoretical, empirical. We are barely scratching the surface, but want to give enough so you understand kind of what informed our methods. And then we'll give two case examples, and their length and number of slides should definitely indicate which is systematic and which is just in time. The systematic, I think, is about 40 slides, and the just in time is about 4 slides. And then we're going to end with just some resources that we have based on everything we're presenting today, if you want to do your own. So really briefly, this is a continuum. You will likely fall somewhere along here. We'll start with systematic. It's good when you have a high stakes, large scale project, when you have funding, time, and leadership involvement, a need to convince people with data. So if you're working across your university or your college and people are disagreeing about how something should be done on a website or in a course design, going this route sort of gives you evidence that's more objective and from your learners' perspectives rather than your own kind of preference. And a desire to publish, present, and share broadly. Luckily, when we started this, we kind of thought we should go ahead and get IRB. We should really do this right in a systematic sense so that we can do more with it. It can require a large team with diverse skills. We were lucky to have research expertise, obvious instructional design expertise, process and project management expertise, and all of that really helped. And multiple months to collect and analyze data. On the other end of the continuum, just as important, and I really want to emphasize that, we are not advocating systematic over just in time. It is all about sort of what you're trying to do and what you have available to accomplish it. Whether you're on the left or the right side of this continuum, we're strong advocates of finding out what even a single person's actual experience of your website or course design is to inform your adjustments. So when you have a single course or design to improve, limited to no time or funding, no need to convince anyone, your only job is to make it better, and no need or desire to publish or present on what you do. All it requires is you and someone else to navigate your course, and around 30 minutes, 5 minutes to find someone, 10 minutes to watch them navigate while thinking aloud, and 10 minutes to identify improvements. Now, of course, that number can go up, but you can really tell the difference in each of these areas. Again, they're equally important, and it's likely you'll fall somewhere along the continuum depending on what you have and the project that you're dealing with. So I'm gonna hand it over to Rhonda Reed, who I sort of describe as the instigator of all of this, to talk about kind of her passion and background and why she sort of encouraged all of us to get into this more.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you to Matt and everybody here today. We're very excited to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and wanted to really examine at this point, talk a little bit more about what learner experience design is and why we think it's important and how we got started with it. So a little bit about my personal background is before I became an instructional designer, I actually was a web designer and developer. And for those of you who have any familiarity with kind of that world, you know that user experience testing is not only pretty common, but it's also considered best practice. So when I transitioned from web design background to learning design, I started asking, well, why aren't we testing our online courses? Because they're happening in the same online environment as website design. And I have to be honest with you, when I first started raising that question, people really balked at that. And a lot, I think, could be summarized by this notion that in education, we're educators. We're not trying to get people to purchase a widget. So there's a difference. And I definitely acknowledge that. You know, we are coming from a standpoint of not a commercial, consumer-based standpoint. We're coming from it for a very noble and altruistic means. But I really did kind of think, like, I think this is kind of missing the point of what learner experience design testing can do. Because really, when we talk about this kind of testing, at its heart is looking at our learning environment and trying to make improvements of it to aid certain learning outcomes happening. And when we think about that, it's actually not too different than what we experience in a residential or physical environment. We do this same kind of practice, but it's a little bit more maybe subconscious, and we're not really doing this kind of formalized testing or even just in time testing. So if you think about your online classroom, if I walk into a classroom as an educator, I'm going to survey my environment. I'm going to look at, you know, are the windows open? Would that provide a distraction to my students as I'm teaching? What's the chalkboard situation, the presentation tools that are available to me? What's my desk situation like? And as I'm teaching students, do I need to change this environment to better support the learning outcomes that I want? So for example, if I do have windows and it's a nice day and I see students are going to look outside the window and maybe be distracted by that, I'm going to pull down the shades because that's going to be a detractor from the learning objectives that I want to achieve. And same thing with, I might want to reconfigure the desk if I have a certain assignment to help facilitate maybe a group discussion or a group project. So as educators, we're making those design decisions on the fly. And really, that's kind of the same basis of what we're talking about for learner design, learner experience design testing is we are going through this testing process in order to build a better design environment for our students to learn. So that was kind of the thinking behind why this kind of testing might be necessary, and had an opportunity to kind of push that topic in 2015 when Penn State as a university was switching over to a new LMS. And I think if there are any learning designers or those on the call who gone through this process before, have some familiarity with it, this is really no small undertaking to switch to a new LMS. And as a learning designer at the time, what it really meant for us was almost going nuclear. We decided to really look at what we were doing with our classes, really looking to see how we could take advantage of this new learning environment, what tools were available to us, and really approached with, let's design these courses from scratch almost. And as we were doing that, mentioned again, what if we start doing this kind of testing? And we decided to test it in the college that Amy Garbrick and I were in. And what we started is we started to glean some really important information from that. And as others around the university heard of that, they said, hey, we want to start doing this too. And then that kind of movement started to grow to include many of the people on the call today, and even more were part of our research group. So that's a little bit about how we came to this. Now, obviously we're talking 2015, so that was a little bit ago, but I will say that since that time, my fervent belief that we need to do this and the importance of it has only grown. And some of that's grown just by changes I've seen in my own life. And one of those is that I'm no longer currently a learning designer, but I moved back to IT project management. And with kind of moving back in IT, I can tell you right now I work at Penn State Central IT, where a lot of our conversations deal with this notion of customer experience. And I know when I put the word customer out there to educators, it's kind of a negative knee-jerk connotation, like, oh, we're not serving customers. But when we use that word in IT, it really does, we're talking about our faculty, students, and staff. We're talking about how we can best serve these people to support what the university wants to do and serve the university mission and serve the education mission. So again, seeing this in a technology environment and just the importance of things like user experience testing, customer service experience is only kind of fortified my thinking on this too. But another change too that's happened since 2015 is that I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to be an online and residential instructor, and having classes of my own has been an incredible experience for me, but it's also been an opportunity to kind of see how students are interacting with some of the environments, and also dealing with an important part of our one of our research goals was we wanted to reduce cognitive load that could impede student learning. And seeing that firsthand as an instructor really kind of drove home to me the importance that we do need to take our learning design environment into consideration to maximize the learning potential. And I will say too, it's a terrible use case, but it is an important one for us too to remember, is that with that violent shift to online learning with the COVID experience, if you think back to that, our students were dealing with so much at that time. I mean, it's a global pandemic. Our whole lives are changing. When they turn to conduct their learning online, we want to reduce the cognitive load of that learning environment. We don't want them to have to ask and to kind of strain themselves thinking, where's the syllabus? How do I achieve X? We want to lessen load for that. And even though thankfully we're coming out of a COVID environment, we don't know the full effect of that will have on online learning. Will more students gravitate towards our online learning? And still the principles are the same. We want to reduce that cognitive load for our students and create better learning environments for them so that they can achieve what we want them to achieve as educators. All right, so sorry, just to sum up a little bit here. So we've talked this notion of user experience and learning experience design. There's some similarities and there's some differences. Obviously, as I mentioned before, when you talk about user experience testing and coming from that web background, a lot of times the focal points of that will be, I'm a designer, I'm going to develop maybe a business website, and the ultimate goal of that business website is to have that consumer buy a widget. And if I don't design the site properly, if there's a misalignment between what I think is important as a designer and how the user actually uses that site, well, that's going to impact the bottom line, and that's going to impact sales and finances. In an education setting, we don't have those concerns, but we do have that bottom line impact. As an instructional designer, if I don't design a course that really meets student needs, there is going to be that bottom line impact, is that could potentially impact the learning outcomes. It could impact student frustration and lead to less effective pedagogy. And those are all things I think we don't want to happen. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Tuche, who's going to talk about Think-Aloud observations.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Thank you. By the way, thanks so much for coming here, and I'm very happy to be here as well. I will very briefly touch on Think-Aloud technique that we implemented, very briefly. because we want to focus on what we did and how we did it. So in order to understand whether the course design was intuitive without guidance such as navigation intro and directions, and identify the points of confusion, and also examine the common navigation behaviors, we implemented Think-Aloud technique. In the very basic sense, Think-Aloud technique consists of asking the users to perform a specific task and think aloud as they try to complete that task. Excuse me. The process of verbalization reveals the assumptions, inferences, misconceptions, and problems that the users face while solving problems or performing that certain task. Perfect. So it's a very common used technique, especially in human-computer interaction field. For those who are familiar with that, I'm sure that you encounter Think-Aloud method quite often. And it is even considered as, like by some, as the most valuable usability engineering method, because as they further argue, it can help detect cognitive activities that may not be visible at all, and enrich the basis for evaluating when and why users experience the problem. I see some interest, great interest in the chat that you would like to learn more about how we did and what we did it. And that's exactly what we're going to talk in this particular session. We're going to talk about what we did, how we did it, and why we did it. And Jen and Amy will start with our systematic approach. Thank you.
Hi, Amy and I are going to step you through the systematic process, which is the longest part of our presentation. And so we are going to go through it as quickly as we can. In this section of our presentation, we're going to go through the whole thoughtful systematic process that we found to serve us well. Once you decide you want to conduct a learning experience design, we hope the steps that we've captured are going to present you with a helpful guide to step you through your own. We broke down our process into 3 main categories: determine, pilot, and do. We will look at each category in more detail on the upcoming slides. We're going to be throwing a lot of information at you, and very quickly, but don't worry. We have resources already compiled for you that we are going to provide at the end. So don't feel like you have to take a lot of notes. We'll provide all the information later. So first, we want to look at the determine steps. When beginning any new endeavor, the best course of action is making some determinations at the onset, which will serve as your blueprint for the rest of the project. We strongly suggest front-loading the work. If you do a thorough job when you're doing the preparation, and actual conducting of the Think-Alouds will be much smoother, and it'll be a more productive experience for everyone. So let's start by looking at the determine section, which outlines the things that we're going to do beforehand. First, we want to determine what should be tested. Determine your foundational elements that you want to test. What is it that you want to test? Identify what your research focus is going to be. Then you want to identify the specific goals of the testing, which could be as simple as testing instructions for an assignment, or as complicated as an entire course like we did with ours. We were testing a full course because we were moving to a new LMS, but you can certainly just test sections of your course. So in our case, the university was adopting a new LMS. We had IDs from different colleges across the university that came together to discuss how we could best present the content and how to set up navigation in the new system for our students. We placed real course content in a test space within our LMS to test the courses. Although we did a large project, the steps in the Think-Aloud method that we used can easily be adapted for a smaller scale project. Next, we want to think about what questions we're going to ask. We want our students to be thinking about the right things. We want them to focus on content rather than finding the content. So once you've identified your goals, you want to write questions and task scenarios that will allow you to evaluate the areas of concern, such as your course navigation, your introduction, directions, that type of thing. Determine what problems need to be solved, and then write the questions as we did in the example on this page. We wanted to see how students would connect with team members, so we asked the participants to demonstrate for us how they would locate them. When writing the questions, decide where in the course the participant should be located when they start the task. So do you want the students to be on the home page? Do you want them to be at a different location within the course? That's going to be super helpful. We provided our participants with a printout of the questions or the tasks to guide them. Here's an example of one. There was room for the students, next slide, yeah. There's room for the students to write their answers, and then we asked them to also speak aloud as they were doing it, and we were taking notes. So we provided students also with the opportunity to rank the difficulty of the task when they were done. So we gave them the task, they would write their answer, and then also rate it. Next, we're going to look at who to test. So typically, it's recommended to select 5 participants, and you want them to mimic the gender and age and other demographic pieces of your student population. It is preferred to use students enrolled in your courses when possible. In our case, the different college units differed in their process of who they tested slightly because they all recruited independently. But as an example, the College of IST recruited all online students, and they did it distributed to match the student demographics by gender and age. Next step is to determine how your Think Aloud information will be captured. At this step, you want to consider how you're going to be capturing the information, in particular, considering what technology needs you will have. We recommend recording the session because it's hard to collect all the information otherwise. Note-taking is another great tool, as well as recording the audio, the video, and screen capture if you can. We used Camtasia for much of our testing to capture the audio and video recordings. We also used external cameras for backup. The next step, when and where. So now we need to decide when and where you're going to test. What will your schedule be for testing? We use a 1-week window or a 1-month window in which you'll conduct your Think Alouds. The technology you decided upon in the last step will also impact the location decision, make sure there's adequate space. For our example, most of the testing, we used a dedicated room, which allowed us to set up the equipment and leave it there in between testing participants. We also determined timeframes we wanted the testing to take place in. We did run into space issues in a smaller office. A larger space would have been better. Also, you want to consider the location regarding the noise level, make sure there's not classes letting out there so that you're not distracting your participants, and also so you can have useful audio recordings. Next, you want to think about necessary forms and funding. If you want to use your findings for research, you're going to also need to consider IRB forms, approvals, permission forms, and funding. We chose to go the IRB route, which resulted in needing to take additional steps, such as consent forms. So on the next slide, you'll see the consent form that we used. We also used a financial signature sheet because we had provided $50 gift cards to each participant. And so for the financial department, we needed to collect that form. And now Amy is going to step us through piloting and do.
Hi, everyone. The next step in the process is called pilot. So after we made our determinations, then we piloted. Piloting is a very important part of the process, and it provides the opportunity to rehearse the entire study before to make sure it's running smoothly before you actually have real participants. Piloting also tests out the tasks to ensure none of them are misleading or confusing. It makes more realistic estimates of time, how long, it's basically practicing, and it validates the data and the wording of the tasks. While this might seem like a duplication of efforts of what we did before, we found it invaluable. In our case, all of our team reported they found it very helpful to practice in the location with the equipment and do a complete run through, sometimes multiple times, of every step that we would take later with an actual participant. We would strongly recommend that you do this to ensure more useful data and a better participant experience. We've ordered the pilot steps in a linear way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in that order. And the steps are: first, pilot your test questions, pilot the equipment and room setup, pilot getting participants to think aloud, and pilot the entire process. So the first one is pilot the test questions. So you work with someone who perhaps is not involved in the project to trial the questions, try them out. Confirm instructions are clear to ensure that wording does not cause confusion with your students or participants. So don't assume that just because it makes sense to you, it will make sense to your participants. And here's an example then of a question where we're asking participants to find a particular assignment, but in this example, the name of the assignment is confusing because there's a similar assignment that has a similar name. So make sure that the confusion of the participant encounters, and there will be some confusion as that's what you're determining, that is with the task you're testing and not a problem with the question or the naming conventions of the scenario, that the question is not a problem. One of the things we did in IST was ask our student interns to run through the test questions and practice conducting the testing with them first. This allowed us to get comfortable with it and identify any sticking points with the questions before the actual tests were conducted. The next step in pilot is to pilot the equipment in the room setup. So we set up the hardware and software in a room. We did a complete run through to detect any problems with that. And we had a backup plan. So some examples are to start the test if you're actually participating in the room, leave enough time so that issues can be fixed, and do a backup plan where you have alternate location, software, hardware, and alternate people to help. So you're covering your bases with a backup plan. Next, we show our equipment picture of what we had set up in our equipment room. So we had a backup camera on a tripod. We had actually two of them, front facing and a back facing. We had screen capture software on the computer capturing what the participants were doing. And we had a task sheet for the participants to go through. So there you can see our setup. The next step in pilot is getting participants to think aloud. This is a very important step in the process. Your purpose is to capture preferences and performance data simultaneously, and that model, you're going to model that think aloud for the participants by physically and verbally doing exactly what someone would do as a participant. So actually walking through this. Participants might feel awkward. This is awkward to talk aloud as you do things. It's not something that we do a lot. So actually demonstrating it to them, practicing it yourself and demonstrating to them is very important. So we use the Think Aloud tasks for the participation. So you don't want to influence the participants in what you do, and you want to practice prompting people to talk aloud, but not telling them what to do. So they're going to have some struggles and some awkwardness there, and that's part of the process. The next step in pilot is piloting the entire process. So from start to finish, you want to practice. This will reveal areas where you need to improve the process and make changes based on what is revealed. It will help that testing to go more smoothly, more comfortably, and better for the participants. So that practice also builds a confidence level for you. As educators, we don't conduct UX studies on a regular basis, so practice helps us in building confidence and providing a more relaxed environment for our participants. We did use things like checklists, so the next screen shows you an example of our checklist, testing checklist. We had to make sure that we didn't miss any steps in setting up and going through the entire process. We also had a moderator script that we used with participants that would be exactly what we intended to say. So the next part is the do. So once you have determined and then you've piloted, the next step is do. And so you actually do it with real participants and you conduct the testing. There may be some repetitions in the third part of the process, but that's okay. It's from piloting and conducting the actual testing. While we've ordered the steps in a linear way, they can be done, some of them can be done at the same time, or you can shift the order slightly. So the steps are recruit the participants and schedule, conduct the testing, capture the observations, analyze the data, and make improvements to your design. The first one is to recruit participants. So you actually want to recruit real users if possible. In our case, it was online students who would be using the new learning management system. So, and you want to think about scheduling. So perhaps schedule gaps in between your testing center So we send an email to instructors in online classes to recruit our students. If online students are not available in your case, or the actual users, you can use colleagues or other people to go through the testing. But ideally, you want the real users to be going through your testing. In the recruitment email, we also directed potential participants to fill out a survey so we could collect additional data. And consider what times and dates that you want to use. The next slide shows our recruiting email. So this is how we explained what the study was. We also offered a $50 gift certificate to Amazon for their participation. That was part of our funding that we had to run this. So we explained things, and this is to have kind of an example or template of what you want to use to get participants to recruit them. The next step is to actually conduct the Think-Aloud observation. So you actually want to do a few things. You want to greet your participants. You want to make sure they feel welcome. You want to provide instructions for how to do the Think-Aloud, how long it will take. And then you want to model the example of how you do it. In our case, we had 2 team members in the room, one asking questions and one taking notes. And so that way we could make sure that we were capturing things. You want to make sure to follow your scripts, the check lines, and be sure that they sign the consent form. I apologize for my dog barking. If the participant is confused, try to go over those steps again and make sure the modeling of the Think-Aloud is very important, that you're modeling that because they're going to follow what you're doing. So if you put all your effort into planning the scenarios and tasks, then this should work smoothly as far as the actual conducting of the TAO. The next step is to actually capture observations during and after. So during the actual testing, you want to capture as much as you can, audio, video, live note taking, and then immediately after, write in your notes so you don't forget what has happened, and you capture all that. Have a backup camera to make sure if you've forgotten to turn on something as far as the record button. Have backups of the recording in case of data loss. So you want to have all those kind of backups, capturing notes in the moment. Next is an example of kind of a task, one of the tasks that we had the participants do. And then underneath is pseudonyms of the people, of our participants, and what they said. So capturing what they said and being able to kind of combine that and be able to analyze it. These are examples of how we kind of captured that information. We'll talk about analyzing the data next. So the next step is to analyze the data. So you can do informal analysis. Doesn't take a lot of time to watch the recordings, to look over the notes, or you can do formal analysis with quantitative and qualitative data analysis. So we started with an informal and went to formal. So we had multiple people in a small group on a research team who watched the recordings together, who read over the notes together, and then we talked about it. What are the things that we found? We also did a formal analysis where we went through and did a deeper dive on our data and all the data that we collected. So the next screen shows you some of the data that we collected, examples of that. So we had the videos that we could actually watch. We had transcripts of the videos that we created. So we had that data as well. Then next we have participant notes. So this is the task sheet that the participants has as they went through. It would give them a task. They would rate it and they put in notes. We had that data. And we also had all the facilitator notes during and after the actual sessions. So we had a lot of data that we could dig into. The next step is to actually make improvements on your design based on what you found. So improvements might be on navigation structures, naming conventions, terminology, or you might even just think of what small changes you can make to improve your design. So for us, it was a standard homepage, standard course navigation, standard naming conventions in Canvas that we wanted to use. And we wanted to minimize multiple interfaces for our students and have consistent design across courses and even across colleges or units that were offering those courses. The next slide shows an example of a task that was asking about a particular assignment the students were confused, the participants were confused because that name, funding scenario assignment, was similar to another name for a totally different assignment in the course. So finding those gotchas of we really need to name each assignment uniquely so students are not confused about the name was important for us to see. So that's what this example is showing. It could be, so this could be improved, the design could be improved if there are unique, distinct names for each assignment. And the last slide in this section on do talks about some of the improvements that we made for our design. So we found that students oriented to courses differently than we did as educators and designers. They relied heavily on modules in Canvas, but they also had kind of their own way to get there, but modules was a key that we found. And they were confused by terminology discrepancies, multiple interfaces. They were confused by inconsistent content organization with the course. They liked consistency and predictability, and they were confused by different designs across courses that took more of that cognitive load that Rhonda mentioned earlier to be able to figure out where's the syllabus and what's this called when they were working on a course and looking through the course. So now the next section is the just-in-time process, and it's back to Andrea.
Okay, great. Thank you. And don't worry, we're going to have time for questions and discussion. I just wanted to very quickly talk about a project I'm doing right now and a very just-in-time version of everything that Jen and Amy just talked through. So the bare minimum, if you want to get some data from a Think-Aloud, is identify a course or a website, determine at least 3 basic tasks a user or learner would complete, find someone to review. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Steve Krug, but Don't Make Me Think and Rocket Science Made Easy. He's a huge web usability guy. And he has a quote in his book that it is better to grab a random person off the street, sit them in a chair and watch them try to do something on your website than to design a perfect study that never ends up getting conducted. So it's always better to have somebody try to use your site or course than to not do it because they don't match parameters, etc. Have the meeting, immediately follow, capture observations, identify improvements, make improvements. So what I'm working on right now in my position, I created for the faculty in my department a site meant to support teaching and learning. And I wanted to get feedback. They are the users, also the learners of what's being put out there. So identifying the site was easy. I identified 3 tasks that they are likely to perform. So new faculty members will be told the site has the resources for the department, and then open the site and talk through how you would use it. We have a lot of faculty that may have used a different LMS before. So you know that Penn State uses Canvas. How would you find out more about it? And you want to see past workshops that Metley, which is the initiative I lead, has offered. How do you find them? So very pragmatic. Find your people. Again, I was really lucky because I just emailed faculty directly and basically my friends and asked, would they do this for me? So they sort of felt like they couldn't say no, which was great. And I got 4 people. I finished 3. I have 1 or 2 to go. I think I'll put another call out. But if I couldn't find any, I would just get somebody who could understand enough to give me some insight. I would ask a friend who wasn't in the department. It really is more important that someone try to do something on your course or site than that they're the sort of perfect person. Scheduled a meeting for 45 minutes. Told them not to prepare anything or do anything. And then in the meeting, we met in Zoom. I briefly explained Think-Aloud and why you do it, demoed the Thinking Aloud process. I picked a random website. I just went to ABC News and imagined I was trying to find international news, and I actually thought aloud doing it. Turned on the Zoom recording, but I also jotted notes. Had them screen share so I could watch them kind of move around. And then I had them do each task. So what you'll find here is the same that you'll find in the systematic, is you have to keep encouraging them to say what they're thinking. They don't want to because they don't want to hurt your feelings, it's unnatural, etc. So you're just constantly saying, okay, tell me more. What are you looking for? What are you thinking? When you see that, what do you think? Why did you click there? Tell me why. So you're constantly doing that. That's probably the hardest part of the whole process, but the most important. And then immediately after, so I'm really going to emphasize two things. I think you've probably heard this a million times from all of us. Do it immediately after. I had 3. The first one I didn't do immediately after because I ran to another meeting and the notes I have from her are less. The other 2, I scheduled time, typed up the notes immediately after, and have a lot more data from that. Now I did record them, but I haven't watched the recordings yet. I may or may not, depending on time and my schedule. So that immediately after is crucial. And don't assume you'll remember it, because while you're watching, you're thinking, oh, she clicked there, why didn't she click here? A week later, you may not remember that you had that observation. And then figure out what you're going to change. So I'm not done going through the data, but I did find some very interesting, easy things. In general, multiple people mentioned they like the logo. When people landed, they just immediately started scrolling. And I spent a lot of time learning how to do these links that go in page. Mixed feelings on the images. One participant said, the images are annoying and they don't do anything related. Another said, if the images weren't here, I would have left the site by now because I don't like to read. I'm in mechanical engineering department. This, no one read. I had to ask because they just scrolled right past it. So even in that very simple 3 45-minute meetings, I got a lot of really good feedback that will go into the improvements. And then just quickly want to give you guys the resources again. The site all of our stuff is on is sites.psu.edu/canvasux. Maybe one of our team can put it in the chat. And then this QR code will also take you directly to our companion site, which goes through each of the steps. And in some cases, it gives you actual examples of what we used. So with all that said, I would like to kind of stop things now and just do questions, discussion, etc. Okay, Martha, that's a great question. And I think that is something that I will do right now. And I'm doing it on the fly. I haven't prepared this. So why don't you guys put in chat a site you want me to go to and give me a task, and I will impromptu think aloud how I would navigate so you can see it real and you know it's not planned. So let's do that first. So for those who actually want to see a Think Aloud demo, just put in the chat a website you want me to go to. Super, thanks, Ahmed. So I'll do ed tech books and then give me a task, Ahmed, or someone for what I should be trying to do on ed tech books.
Try to find a chapter there that talks about project management and learning design.
Okay, perfect. So let me get there and then I'll share my screen. Actually, I won't even get there before I share my screen. I'm going to show you guys from the very scratch what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to hit ed tech books and go directly, hopefully, to that website. Taking a little while to load. And I typed in the wrong URL. So let me actually copy it from the chat, o.org.
Yeah, edtechbooks.org.
Okay. So I open the website and I am immediately drawn to free textbooks and journals. The very first thing I tend to do when I'm on a website and I have something in mind is I go to the search. I see that there's a search bar here, which is nice. I also see search up here. Those are two things I always look for. I just now noticed this graphic, which is interesting and curious, and I'm not sure how I feel about it given what I'm trying to find. But I know my task is project management and instructional design, but I'm also a little curious about what the books are here because this is my field. So I might scroll and just look at some of these topics. I think they could draw me in, so I'm gonna go away from that for now. So I will just type in project management and instructional design. I noticed there's no enter or search here, which is not a big deal because I would normally just hit enter, but it is something I noticed wasn't there. And no search results were found. Okay, so that's a little bit of a bummer, but maybe the search was too complex. So I'm going to get rid of instructional design, and then it automatically. So now I see how the search bar works. I don't have to click enter, it just brings it up. So then I see the book that's exactly the topic I'm looking for. I would click on the book. I still don't know if I'm looking at like a whole book, if I'm looking at something that's going to eventually link me to Amazon. But okay, I see press books, which I've heard of and know that they often have completely open source. Okay, Creative Commons. So now I'm thinking this, I might have access to a whole book. So that's what I would do. And that's how I would demo it to a student or a participant. And that I think, so those are my two main points. Definitely do that demo, practice doing the demo. It's super awkward if you haven't done it. I'm only comfortable doing it because I've done it like 50 times. Practice it, then practice it in front of someone, and then write up your notes right after the meeting. If you learn nothing else, those are the two key things. So what other questions do folks have? Oh, thanks, Matt. Yep, that's perfect. And actually, I think Steve Krug, Rocket Science Made Easy, I think that he has even some links to videos on the website for that book that maybe go to YouTube videos where he demos it, or there was something in that book that was also super helpful on the website. Yep, so Matt just put a link in. There are good examples out there. What you're really trying to get at is all that stuff that you think, sometimes not even consciously, that the designer's never going to be aware of. They're never going to be aware that you might wonder why there's not an enter bar there. Or that it's going to take you a half a second to realize that it searches a little differently than you were expecting. So some of those things aren't a big deal. When all your users figure something out in a half a second, not a big deal. But if it's something where they aren't ever clicking where you thought they would click, big deal. Now, actually, one thing I would add from a systematic perspective that we didn't do at the time, but if we had the expertise and we were doing all this again and had the funding and the team and all of that, I would probably integrate eye tracking because that takes it a step further than what we did and can really dig into where people are looking and where you want to kind of front load the most important things. Thanks, Tuche. So what other questions, or for the rest? Yep, Ahmed.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm curious if you care or like to make the distinction between approach to design, a method to design, and a design technique. And do you think this distinction is useful in framing when we, educators, designers, design practitioners, want to advocate or prescribe something that other learning designers should do? And in the interest of full transparency, there might be a follow-up or two based on your answer.
Okay, so say the three things again: methods of design,
approach to design, a method of design, and a design technique. Because throughout the presentation, I mean, the title of the presentation, Think Aloud, a method or methods of Think-Aloud. And then Turja at some point said Think-Aloud technique.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah,
Yep.
so do you think we should make those distinctions, first of all, between approach to design, a method to design, and a design technique? I personally do, and I think it's helpful, but I'm curious to learn from your wisdom. Do you think that distinction is
Yeah, so
useful or
that's a
not?
great question. So if you think back to the continuum slide on the systematic slide, we probably were not all the way at the left because we were not interested in researching the validity of Think-Aloud as a practice. We took that for granted. And so as you can see, our language was sort of casual. Like we were not, none of those differences were intentional. They were just, to us, they're from a pragmatic perspective. I didn't think differently about method versus technique versus approach.
Gotcha.
So if we were doing formal research on Think-Aloud, and like Tuche's done a ton of just lit review and research in this area. So it's a lot more complicated if you really want to dig into it. But our main goal was, how are students navigating our courses so
Gotcha.
that designers can quit arguing their preferences, and let's actually watch students do it. So yeah, that's a good question.
Gotcha. So the follow-up that I have here, so and I'm curious to hear more. First, I appreciate what you said, Andrea, right at the beginning. You said we're not advocating for systematic or just in time over systematic, and really it depends. And that and kind of the underlying meaning is that you emphasize the need for strong design judgment and expertise by the designer to choose and pick when it's used a systematic approach and when it's used to use a just-in-time approach or somewhere in between. And I appreciate that. So, yet I heard something from Rhonda, and I'm curious to hear more from Rhonda about one statement you said. So based on your rich professional experience situated in your professional organization, do you have evidence of instructional designers not conducting usability testing of what they have designed? And what is the nature of that evidence coming from?
Well, I would say that just from the beginnings, and we're going back to maybe 2013 here, just raising the question of, do we test? Do we get feedback from what we're designing? At least at that time, it was kind of unheard for the circles that we were operating in. I didn't go out and do a lot of, I guess, academic type of research, but I can tell you kind of just anecdotally that when we started this and we did kind of take a more academic approach to writing papers and doing things like that, at that time, there didn't feel like there was a ton of additional research that was conducted too. So we did feel at the time that this was something that was maybe just starting to take a little bit more notice, wasn't done a lot in practice, and wasn't even being considered or talked about. How do we get that kind of feedback, any kind of feedback from our students on what we've designed?
I mean, I can say I worked in a unit with 20 plus designers and no one ever did this. At most, we would roll our chair over to someone else and say, look at this, which do you like better? At most. So I think that unless things have changed dramatically since I was a hands-on designer, it's practical. You're busy, you're trying to get feedback, you're working with faculty, you're creating these courses. Like, it's just not something in your practice. Okay, so I like the question of what mistakes did we make, because I love talking about our mistakes. So who wants to share mistakes? What we would do differently. I think a lot of this presentation was based, not a lot. There were definitely a few things, do what we say, not what we do, or not what we did, because I think we did some testing before piloting. I think we did a dry run and it was after some tests had been done, and people kind of had an eye-open moment of, oh, we should have done that. One thing I should mention is while we were doing this, we would debrief and say what worked, what didn't, how do we improve it for the next run? So it was iterative in that sense as well. Other mistakes people want to mention for Meryl's question?
Maybe I can chime in. I don't
Sure.
know. So one thing might be to pay extra attention is to moderators. because how moderators facilitate sessions impacts the data that you collect from Think-Aloud's data collection sessions. So it might be helpful in the future that to set certain norms for moderators, like for example, not intervening any processes or not explaining anything to the participants while they are doing certain tasks. So it might be helpful to make those decisions before you collect data, and then ensure that all moderators behave in the same way in the data collection. So in that way, there will not be any kind of fluctuations in terms of the data that you collect, because sometimes people are guided a little bit further than other people in some sessions. So this creates some kind of fluctuations in the data that you collect throughout those sessions.
Oh, that's a great point. And Tuche is the one who analyzed all of the data. So she knew in great detail sort of how different facilitators worked because we could see that in the data. Yeah, so ideally facilitators would be pretty identical in their practices, or you'd have one facilitator. So Max, what approach do you use to create good interface and navigation designs? I think that, so the website I just created, it's my first time using Divi in WordPress. So I looked at a lot of Divi examples, things that I resonated with. But luckily from doing my just-in-time testing, found out some features, they're just not useful to people. So I'm gonna get rid of those. I think in the learning management system, one of the big takeaways was design within the logic of the learning management system. Yes, designers can tweak things or work behind the scenes or figure out how to insert code or, but at least within Canvas, it's set up to be used in a particular way, and it's not bad, may not be the prettiest thing or the most exciting thing, but it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to get around. So I think the basic model is don't make them think about the stuff they don't need to think about. Finding things, naming, etc. They need to think about the content, their assignments, their interactions, all of that. Okay, so we just got the message from Matt. So just Martha to use for training courses. I think anything, you can use Think-Aloud on anything. It's used for product design. Like I said, I'm in mechanical engineering now. It's a method used for anything. So it's always helpful. Okay, so Matt, I'll hand it back to you in terms of any wrap up or closing.
Outstanding. I don't have very much to wrap up or close with. I just wanted to thank you and all the presenters for this excellent presentation. There's been some outstanding conversation and questions as follow-ups, and many questions continue to feed into the chat. I'm hoping that some of you will reach out to the team and continue these conversations, but we do need to wrap up for today. So thank you everyone for coming. You can expect to see this webinar posted online presently, and there will be more in the Learning Experience Design webinar series. So stay tuned to the usual channels and we'll be sending out information when it becomes available. All right, folks, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you guys.